that you're here. Glad that the ones that are here are here. You've heard this analogy before, but you know, if Mom will fix supper for you, whether you show up or not, she still fixes it for you. And that's kind of how it is when we prepare. You know, I believe the Lord put this series really on our hearts, and I know especially this one this morning, I'm honestly excited about giving it. And the book of Daniel, which we'll be talking about, it's actually one of the things that came in when I asked people for some response. It was the book of Daniel. They may not be here, but hey, I still fixed it for you. We're still prepared for it here. And so, as always, you know, you can share on Facebook and get this out and those sort of things. But Charles Dickens wrote a book in 1859, which it's a crazy long time ago now, but it's called A Tale of Two Cities. And A Tale of Two Cities talks about Paris and London during the French Revolution. But in the Bible, I think we have a tale of two cities, in a sense. Now, obviously, there's a lot of cities with importance in Scripture. But Babylon and Jerusalem are two cities, and whether some of it's just at the actual city or just the spiritual significance of that city, you will see those cities from the beginning to the end. And Babylon starts all the way back, if you remember the story of the Tower of Babel, and that's exactly where it was at. And basically what they were doing was they were denying God, in a sense. And they said, we want to be better than God. We're going to build a tower that's so huge that we're going to be into the heavens. And they were working toward it because they wanted it to be above God. They were denying Him. It was idolatry. And it was at the Tower of Babel where the story of the Bible tells us that the languages were confused. And honestly, when you look at so many things, the traditions that you see all across the world, before we had internet, before we had the ability to travel, the stories were so similar in cultures, in Persian culture, in Greek culture, in Roman culture, in Chinese culture, even the zodiac. It has similarities, I believe, because everyone was of one language and they told the same story, the same gospel, until the languages were confused at the Tower of Babel. Now that whole traditional thing continued, and Babel became Babylon, which is in present-day Iraq. It's still there. And by the way, some of you that are especially my age, you'll remember a guy by the name of Saddam Hussein, and he said, I want to be the next Nebuchadnezzar, and he said, I'm going to rebuild Babylon. We know where he's at now. I don't say that to be funny or anything. I think Saddam Hussein went to a place that was probably, I would say without a doubt, that I hate that anybody would have to go there. He did not become the next Nebuchadnezzar, but he had this idea that he would rebuild Babylon. It was one of the 7 known wonders of the world, Babylon back in its day and in its prime. It was huge. It was significant. And that's where the children of Israel are going to be carried into captivity. Now, I'll go a little bit over the history here in a moment, but this is how Daniel starts. They are, these children, these people, Israelites, are in Jerusalem in the capital. By the way, it just significantly became the capital again in the last, so many years. Netanyahu, who was, I think, kind of helped bring all that together, he's now over that again, and Israel just came through the last elections. He was out for a while, now he's back in. I think that Jerusalem is still a significant place. It has been forever, no matter how many people have tried to destroy it, no matter how many people have fought against Israel, have fought against Jerusalem, it still stands today. And my understanding is you could fly into Tel Aviv. Back in the early 1900s, there was like no city there. And now there's over 1 million people in Tel Aviv because Jews are flocking back to their homeland. And it's all really prophecy coming fulfilled. The book of Daniel has a lot of prophecy in it, and that's probably what intrigues a lot of people about it. But it's a story that's very relevant to our lives today. And that's what, if I was in Hollywood, if I could produce a movie and make it a Bible movie, and listen, I would get some of the best actors, man. I don't want to sit here and tell you who I think that is, but I would get some well-known dudes to do this. And I would do the story of Daniel because I think it's one of the most awesome stories that there is. And just the real life things that happen, the history that we can learn and see from the book of Daniel, the history that you can read in history books. And we have a history professor right here, I guess you could say professor teacher here, and I know that he knows a lot about the history. I know there's so many people that love the history part of it. But the Bible is real history. And Daniel was a real live person who lived during this time period. We'll get to it in a minute. I don't want to talk too much. But how many people have ever heard the names Azariah, Mishael, Azariah, and Hananiah? Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael. I'm saying the same names but in a different order. Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael. Okay, how many people have heard of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? All right, it's the same people, by the way. And we'll get to that. But we're going to see that here in this book as we go through the book of Daniel, chapter 1, and it's significance. Now I want to kind of try to, as the way I teach anymore, at least more recently, if I'm going through a book, and just kind of hit the high points of it, and I have some significant points to bring out at the end when we get to this, and how this is, I think, feel like it's relevant to us today. But these young men, I mean, you have to understand, this was prophesied. Now, Israel, this is a little bit more to history. I don't have a picture up here, but Israel, it broke into 12 different sections, which were the 12 tribes of Israel. And Israel itself is a land that's about, 300 miles long by 30 miles wide. It's not entirely huge. I mean, it's like land population, I think it's probably smaller than the state of North Carolina. It's not that big. But 12 tribes took it, and then about 1,000 years BC, that's when David became king, Solomon became king, and then it broke up after Solomon. So that there were 10 areas of Israel were the northern section, and that was called in the Old Testament Israel. Now the two at the bottom, they're the ones that stuck closer to God in a sense. They were known collectively as Judah. Now that's where Jerusalem ended up, and that's those two southern tribes. The 10 northern tribes, they had some very wicked kings. I don't think they really had any real good ones. And God said about 700 BC, about 300 years after the king started, He said, okay, Assyria is going to keep you captive. And so they were never heard from again. I mean, really, they're wandering around. They're still all over the earth, I'm sure, but they were carried away. But there was the two southern tribes stayed true to God. But Isaiah, who lived around the time of the northern tribe's captivity, he said, I'm telling you what, guys, you've begun to sin and you've done things wrong. And God doesn't take it lightly. And really, some people will look at Isaiah and say, well, he didn't really write this then. And you know why they say the same thing about Daniel? You know why? Because the prophecies they wrote came true. And they're like, how did this happen? But even the Dead Sea Scrolls that they found confirmed that these things were written hundreds of years before Jesus was born. But Isaiah said, listen, guys. And Hezekiah, he was a king then. Hezekiah said, he showed, Nebuchadnezzar's people, he showed them all their vessels and stuff that they worshiped with. And Isaiah said, this is bad. You shouldn't have done that. You should not have done that. He said, there will come a time when the people of Babylon will take your children captive and they will emasculate your sons. In other words, they will make them to where they cannot have children. Isaiah said that 100 years before this. And so at this time, it's about 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's people in Babylon are in power. And they come to Jerusalem and they ransack it. And they kill the older people and the middle-aged people. And most of who they take with them are the young ones. And I had this, I thought I had this picture of so many of these teenagers and 20-somethings that were going to be here today. Because I know how much they need this. I know how much they need this fortitude and this conviction and this reality that Daniel went through. And how they need God through it all. That's what the whole book's about. We could say it's about prophecy, we could say it's about this, but it's about the sovereignty of God. It's about God who is in control. That's what the book of Daniel's about. But when they come there, and Daniel, he's no doubt, he's just I guess I could read it, and I'll get there in a minute, but I'm just trying to build this up a little bit. But imagine. You've been worshiping for hundreds of years. You've had the temple where you worship. You had your home set up where your families, where everybody lived. And they just come in and they start burning, they start looting, you're watching as they're holding you back, beating your mom and your dad and your cousins and all that, and they're beating people, they're killing people. I mean, it don't go into a lot of detail, but we know historically how these things worked. And it was a horrible, horrible thing that these people lived through. And this is what happens, Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim. Now, when you read something like that, unless you're an astute student and know all the kings and when they lived, it doesn't mean a lot until you look into it. But this would tell us exactly when this happened. And it confirms with other historical sources that this was true. It was around 605 BC. Jehoiakim was king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar was king of Babylon. He came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, so you have to understand this. As I said, it was prophesied. It says the Lord gave. So here is God's people, and He gives them. He allows Nebuchadnezzar to take them. He told him He was going to, and this is why He did it, because He saw the iniquity of Israel over and over again, how they would go to idolatry, how they would not adhere to what God told them to do, how they didn't love God like they told them they was going to, how they didn't do the things that they knew they were supposed to do, and God finally said, I've had enough. And He allowed Nebuchadnezzar to come in and take them. And there comes a time, listen, I don't want to be the negative preacher, that everybody says you're negative, but the truth is, there comes a point where we have to look around us and say, there's going to come a point when God says, I've had enough. And I want to, there's things about me that loves how 1950 was, I wasn't, by the way, I wasn't around in 1950. Some of y'all might have been, but I wasn't around in 1950. But when people think about how things used to be, when you hear your grandpa or your dad talk about it, and those people, they're often in their mind, they're thinking about 1950. And in 1950, and even when I was a kid, you'd have teachers would quote Bible verses to you, and you could, most everybody you talked to was going to church on Wednesday night. They were having prayer meetings and all that thing. But you know what? It's not like it now. And really, the story of Daniel will tell us, listen to me here. It tells us this. That's okay. It's how you respond to it. I may not be able to tell my culture how to do things, but I know how I can live in it. Daniel tells us how someone can maintain their identity as a Christian, as a person of God, living in a culture that's not like that. Daniel got carried away from we'll just say Christian. It was not Christian. It was Israel. It was Jewish. You understand what I'm saying? But in our time period, it would be like if we are carried away from our Christian culture and set down under someone else's rule where we cannot do everything that we were brought up doing. Daniel tells us this. That's okay. You can still do it. They can come to me and say, okay, you cannot worship anymore. Now, I pray this never happens in America, and hopefully it won't. But they can come and say, you can't worship like this anymore. Well, you know what you got to do? Okay, guys, y'all come to my house, and we're meeting at 9 o'clock Sunday morning in the basement. You still do it. Or when you're out at work, you talk to somebody and say, hey, come here, we want to talk about it. I'm going to tell you what I learned this week. Hey, I want to tell you how God's working with me. They may be able to stop certain things, but they cannot stop you. You understand? I mean, the culture may be changing, but that don't mean that you have to leave everything. You still have to maintain your integrity. You still have to maintain your identity. And Daniel tells us how to do that. We can sit and complain, and I know so many people are tired of hearing about the old people talking about how bad things are getting and how things are getting and everything. It is. There's things that I don't like. But what are you doing, God? How are you responding to it? That's what Daniel tells us about. And here Daniel, they're carried away here in verse number 2. The Lord gave them Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, and with some of the vessels of the house of God. Now, the vessels of the house of God are those things that you learn about that are in the temple, in the Old Testament temple, that God instructed Moses how to build them. They had the menorah there, the 7-lamp candle. They had, no doubt, there was things like the Ark of the Covenant and the table of showbread. All these things that were in the temple that were holy during the Old Testament period where, literally where it said they would go in and God would meet with them there. Those vessels were taken. It was like a trophy to Nebuchadnezzar to take those things that Israel used to worship with. When it says vessels, don't take that lightly. That's what he's talking about. And he said he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. So he takes these trophies that Israel used to worship with, and he puts them up in his temple. Now, just picture this. There's no way, we can't even picture the significance of this really in our culture, because we don't have anything like that. We don't have, vessels of gold and silver where people come in and have to keep the lamp burning 24 hours a day. You have priests doing that year around the clock, over and over and over. We don't have anything like that. We can't. It's hard to even comprehend the significance of this. So then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and the nobility. So I want you to understand that when he has the chief of the eunuchs, which the eunuchs is a man who has had his manhood stripped from him, okay? This is a guy who cannot have children. And when the chief of the eunuchs is over these young men, that's telling us that they did the same thing to those young men. So when you have Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, and honestly, I titled this whole thing Against the Flow, and that's a John Lennox book, by the way, Against the Flow, when he's talking about Daniel and those people, but they went against the flow. But one of the sources I used a good bit for this is David Jeremiah, when he talks about the ages of Babylon. I mean, you could just the side story of that, and then he goes into the history, but just thinking about what may have happened, or you could just picture Daniel and these three other young men. I mean, the next verse says it like this. It says, in verse 4, it says, youth without blemish. So that word youth literally means in the Greek, it's someone that's described as someone between about 14 and 17 years old. I mean, just think how old they were. There's a few in here that's that age, a couple of years that age. They were between 14, they were probably between 14 and 17 years old. And they were at a time where Daniel, he probably watched them kill his parents. And then to make the trip from Jerusalem to Babylon, no doubt they lived off little bits of nothing, and it was somewhere between 700 and 900 mile walk for prisoners that may have been strapped together or chained together or whatever they were together. They may have got to eat bread and water or something, and it would have probably taken 3 or 4 months to get there. And then when they get there, you're thinking, Daniel, they may have had girlfriends. I mean, and they're like looking around saying, where is Leah, or where is Rachel, or where is whoever, and they're like, and they may never see him again. The significance of what has just happened cannot be overlooked. Their life has drastically and completely changed from a sense of security and safety where they could worship the way they were taught to worship, where they could go to the temple like they were supposed to go, to now being captive by a group of pagans that says you cannot do this. This is how we're going to teach you to do these things now. But Daniel and his friends maintained their integrity, their identity, but they did it in a culture that was not like theirs. They did it in a culture that wasn't, you have to pick your battles in some ways. And you'll see this through the book of Daniel, how that they did pick that. But you see it so much, a little bit right here. So it says, Ashpenaz, so here they are, they were, just think of that though. I mean, they could have found, if they did find their girlfriends and be like, well, I can never have kids anyway. And they did that for that reason. They did that for so many reasons why they would have no doubt have done that. I mean, so Daniel and his friends, Josephus, who wrote, around the 1st century, he was a Jewish historian, he wrote that Daniel and all three of these friends were from the same lineage as Zedekiah, who was king. So they were in that same lineage, but it stopped with them. They never had any children. They were never able to pass that on. But yet the significance of what they've done in their life still speaks to us today. Isn't that awesome? So here it is. It says, youth, verse 4, without blemish of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. So literally, of all the no doubt hundreds and thousands of youth that they brought captive to their land, they picked the ones who were they were the ones that tested highest on the IQ, or did the best on their SAT, ACT tests, and they even looked good. I mean, that's what it says, that they were without blemish. And he picked them and said to teach them in the art of the Chaldeans. And that word, that was kind of, it's sometimes associated with wizardry and witchcraft and those sort of things, but it was basically that language of the Babylonians that lived there, and they were teaching them that. So this is what Nebuchadnezzar wants to do. He takes these people who are at this very, very impressionable age, and sociology will tell you this. I mean, you could take someone that's between 14 and 17 years old, and you can completely and totally mold them. That's why being a teenager is such a great and important time. It's the time where you become who you're going to be. And that may take a little while. It takes a little longer than 17. I'm 47. I'm still trying to figure it out some days. But you're so impressionable at that age. When we moved here, when we moved to North Carolina, my kids were around that age, 14, 17. This will always, I feel like this will probably always be home to them. In their mind. For me and Laura, it's different. Because we weren't 14 and 17 when we lived here. There's just something about that age that's so impressionable. In my mind, I still go back and I think of myself as around 19 years old, but I'm not. I tried jogging yesterday. I say I tried. It's not a New Year's resolution. I've been resoluting since I was 16 to jog, so it's not like a new thing. But some days I know I'm not 19. You know what I'm saying? Especially after eating everything from Christmas to New Year's. You just understand it. Your body changes. But Nebuchadnezzar said, I want you, basically this is what he's thinking when he's indoctrinating them. He's telling them, I want you to forget how you were raised. I want you to forget everything religiously significant in your life. He's indoctrinating them in the ways of their pagan gods, their language, everything. He's trying to educate them in that. And verse 5 says, the king assigned him a daily portion of the food that the king ate, and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Now, one of the things that David Jeremiah I thought was interesting. He said it's easier to get into Harvard than it is to become an employee at Google. He said 1 out of 130 people that apply to work at Google gets hired, but 1 out of 14 people that apply to Harvard get into the school. Because Google's process of hiring somebody, it says it takes an average of 37 days, several interviews, over and over again, how they go through all this grueling process. And they say that to say this. These people went through a 3-year process to find out if they were the ones that were going to do this. And they were indoctrinated. They were taught. It was 3 long years, and they had to pass all these different tests. They had to do all this. They had to continue to be that way before the king. And among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And that speaks into the historical significance that I was talking about with Judah and all that. It says, and the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. He literally, not only did they want to indoctrinate them in their ways, in their culture, they literally said, we don't even want you to have the same name. I mean, can you imagine? All these kids that are in Babylon, would run up and they'd see all these strange-looking young people, they probably looked a little different from Jerusalem, and you could just picture one of them. And I think this is kind of how John Lennox brings it out. He says, you see this young man named Nabu, and he runs over, he's talking to them after they can get to where they can talk a little, and he's like, what do they call you? What's your name? They said, Daniel, which by the way, would probably be correctly pronounced as Daniel. El means God, and it means judgment of God. Daniel's name meant judgment of God. And Nabu would be like, well, that's an odd name. He said, well, no, it's very significant. And what about you? Well, I'm Azariah. And yeah, I have to look. I think Azariah says, it means Yahweh is my helper. It's Azariah, that's what it means. They were named significantly. Mishael, whose name meant, who is like God. Their names spoke to a one God culture. Every single one of them. Hannah meant Yahweh or God is gracious. This was their names. This was their significance. But when your name means something that's completely directed at a one God, which is who we worship, it's who the Jews worship, when it speaks of that and you go to a culture that believes in multiple gods, they say, you can't keep that name. Daniel, we're going to change your name. And they changed his name to Belteshazzar, which meant Baal would protect his life. Baal was one of their gods. And you can see it in the rest of them. Shadrach meant the command of Aku. The same thing with Meshach and Abednego meant servant of Nebo. These were gods that were under Nebuchadnezzar or the Babylonian culture. So they literally, as John Lennox points out, you could literally teach or preach or show the gospel in the names of those 4 kids. God is my judge. God is my helper. God is gracious. Who is like God? Isn't that awesome? These 4 kids whose names literally meant, when you just line them up and talk to them, it would be like, God who is my judge, who is like him, but he's gracious. And he's my helper. But Nebuchadnezzar said, we can't have that. Let me tell you something. It doesn't matter what they call you. It doesn't matter what your name is. And this is the words of the song. I am who he says I am. And I don't care whether they call you Belteshazzar or Meshach. It's what is in you that makes the difference. Your history doesn't matter from here on out. Maybe you're the kind of person, and I'll tell you this resolve for a new year, maybe you're the kind of person that makes resolutions, and you got up this morning, and you've already messed up. Start right now. But I would say, number one, make your resolutions easy enough that you can do it. I don't, as far as exercise and those sort of things, I always try to do that. But personally, I don't make resolutions that I'm going to work out before I go to work in the morning. You know why? Because I know I'm not going to do it. It's not going to happen. I'm not getting up at 3:30. 4:30 is early enough. I'm just not going to do it. If you want to do that, great. Stick to it. But just make something you know you can do. Stick with it. But here's what I want you to understand. If you're making a resolution, understand that all those things are important. Bodily exercise, as Paul said, it profits little, which I think it means it does profit. But godliness is profitable in all things. Every promise of that which now is and that which is to come. Make a resolution that's spiritually significant in your life. I mean, when we talk about exercise, sit down, read a chapter every morning. At least read a verse every morning. Memorize a verse a week. Pray every day. Make a resolution that you're going to do something more spiritually significant, and something my wife and I have talked so much about over the last months and years, to be intentional about forming relationships. And that don't just mean here with people in the church, but if you want to minister to someone, if you want to be significant in someone's life, sit down and talk to them, learn who they are, find out how you can help them. I mean, there are people, and I got people even in my mind, some that I was hoping to be here. I know the things that they're fighting. I know the things that's going on in certain people's lives, and you're like, the best way you can help them is to be in front of them. I know you can't live with them, you can't do all these things, but be available to people. Even if it's just a little bit. If you want to be significant in somebody's life, make a resolution to do that. Make a resolution to impact one person this year. You don't even have to, You don't have to impact one person a week. No, that would be great. But if you want to do something you know you can keep, just make a resolution to impact one person for the glory of God. And I'm saying outside of this church. Someone who you know needs something spiritually significant in their life. Make it a point this year to impact their life. Just one person. A whole year. 365 days. Here we go. I want to go on with the story. I gotta see what time it is because I don't want to go too long. 11:27. I'm good for a few minutes. So here's what it said. So he changed their names, but, verse number 8, Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. But Daniel resolved. See, these boys who traveled 800 miles, took them 4 months to get there, probably lost every bit of muscle they had getting there. They get there and they're trying to train them, and this was the cream of the crop, and they sit them down, they got the king's food at their disposal. Everything they could eat. I'm sure when Daniel looked at it, his friends are sitting around and some of these other guys, and Daniel goes, I can't eat that. Can you imagine some other boys going, Daniel, come on, dude. It's just food. But Daniel said no. And there's several reasons for that. Because in the kosher laws, I'm sure the kosher laws, you know, the meat had to clove the hoof, or split hoof, and it has to chew the cut. So there's so many things that don't do that. A pig's one of them. That's the most well-known that we think of. Jews can't eat pig. Now, I don't know if they had pig there. You know, you also can't eat, out of the sea, it has to have fins and scales, so they couldn't eat lobster, couldn't eat all those things. But there's probably, I'm sure that was an aspect of why Daniel said I couldn't defile myself. But it probably had something to do with he understood that these things had been sacrificed to idols. And they weren't allowed to do that. And the other thing that John Lennox brings out that I hadn't really thought about, he said, notice that the wine, and they brought the vessels from the house of the Lord, he said, it's probably possible that at Nebuchadnezzar's table, some of these very vessels that Daniel recognized and knew from Jerusalem, Babylonians were using them to desecrate, basically, the image of God. They were using them just to drink wine out of, and all these. We don't know exactly what Daniel means, but we do know that Daniel said, I cannot do this. I won't do it. So Daniel, Azariah, Mishael, and Hananiah, the four of them said, we will not do this. We will not defile ourselves. Now, when I say you pick your battles, there is nothing, and I just bring this up because I know so much of Protestant teaching and those things that we hear over and over, and some in some cultures more than others. We hear so much about what you wear. And listen, those things are important. We hear so much about, different translations. And this is just some of the things that come to my mind. Those things never come up in the book of Daniel. He never complains about having to wear what the Babylonians wear. He never says, no, I will not defile myself with those garments. And we don't see that. But he picked his battle. He said, these things were used in idolatry. I think that's probably what it was. And he said, I'm not going to do it. And literally, when they say we're not going to do this, they're endangering the guy that's over them. Now, I'm just going to kind of summarize some of these. We'll be done here soon. But Ashpenaz says, you're endangering my life. He's the one that was under the king that was over these guys, these other eunuchs. And he said, you're endangering my life. And Daniel said, let me tell you what. And this is in those next few verses. I'm not going to take time to read it. Daniel says, I'll tell you what. Instead of us eating all this food that you put out here, I understand how good it looked. I can just imagine what was there to these people that probably haven't eaten well in forever. He said, I'll tell you what we will do, me and my three friends, we'll eat vegetables. That's basically what it was. He said, and the rest of you guys, they can eat all this stuff, and we'll see in 10 days who's doing better. Now they call it, this is what they call a Daniel fast. If you hear people talking about a Daniel fast. A 10-day fast on vegetables and water is a Daniel fast. And later on in the book, you'll see it 21 days, and that's another Daniel fast. And I have to say, we were just talking about this on watching a TV show the other day at somebody who was a vegan. It's not bad enough to be a vegetarian. I mean, if you're vegan, and there may be some in here that's vegans, I don't want to make too much fun of it, that's fine, that's what you want to do. Personally, I'm on a seafood diet. If I see it, I eat it. That's pretty much what I do. I just try to limit that a little bit. I go through different stages, and if you're vegan, that's fine, but what do you eat? I mean, if you can't have milk, you can't have butter, I mean, you can't have eggs, anything that comes from an animal, you can't have. And so basically, you're eating broccoli, Brussels sprouts, and cauliflower all day. I don't know how you live. Somebody, if you're a vegan in here, you come up to me afterwards and tell me how you get through it and how good it is, and we'll talk about it. Maybe me and Laura should start that this year. I don't know. 10 days, I might be able to do for 10 days. And what you're thinking, and really it speaks to something. It speaks to that meat is actually healthy. Because Ashkenaz says there's no way you could do this and come out better than the rest of these boys. And you know what happened after 10 days? And he looked at him and he said, my goodness. He said, the four of you, after eating nothing but vegetables and water, have actually gained more weight, more muscle, he said, because it's flesh, than the rest of them. And you know why? Because God was in what they were doing. God was in it. And I'm just going to flip over. Verse 20. It says, in every matter of wisdom and understanding by which the kingdom parted, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in the kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. And I just wanted to throw that in there. And I'm going to hit just 3 quick points, 3 or 4. When he says until the year of King Cyrus, understand, they were in captivity for 70 years. And that was prophesied. That's what Isaiah told them was going to happen. Jeremiah said it would be 70 years, and there was a reason for that. I won't go into it for the sake of time. But they were there for 70 years, and then the king of Persia, Cyrus, comes in, and he takes over. So Daniel was there. So Daniel, when he's there, he's in his 80s. He's 80 years old by then. And you'll see the significance of that if you hang with me through the book. But this is a long time. And so this is just quickly, just what I want to speak into. And when I say quickly, I mean just 2 minutes. Resolve for a new year. And you've heard this phrase, dare to be a Daniel. This is what I want to leave you with. Number one, you have to be patient. And I say that to myself. You know, I've talked about my patience. But Daniel and the boys went there. And they said, we're not going to do this. Everybody else did, as far as we know. We'll see that more in the rest of the story. They said, we're not going to do this. And we think, well, no doubt God blessed them. But Daniel, they never saw the fruit of it for years and years and years and years. They didn't see the significance of it. But they remained faithful and steadfast anyway. I mean, God did miracles in Daniel's life, but he never delivered him out of Babylon. You understand what I'm saying? I mean, we look at this in our American culture. If you're my age or older, you think, my goodness, where has everything gone? God may never deliver us out of that, but he can do miracles through it. Daniel shined in the culture of the Babylonians, but there was a certain line that he said, okay, I'm not crossing this. He was willing to be educated by Nebuchadnezzar. He never complained about it. They sat down, no doubt they probably dressed in what they gave them. They learned from their own books, the Babylonians. No doubt they did certain things that the Babylonians did over and over and over again, but when they brought in food and wine, it was sacrifice and different things. He said, okay, this is where we draw the line. But he had to be patient. It doesn't happen overnight. I've heard people over and over and say, we often overestimate what we can do in 1 year, but underestimate what we can do in 5. Be patient. It's hard for me. Now those boys, they didn't see the fruit for years and years and years. Secondly, it takes conviction. You can call it confidence, you can call it principle, you can call it faith. But conviction is a firmly held belief or an opinion. When Daniel got to a certain point, he's like, and I can just imagine all the other Jewish boys sitting around going, dude, just eat it. And he's like, no, I will not. I will not do this. And they're like, well, we're just going to call you Belteshazzar anyway. And deep down he knows, you can call me what you want, but I know who I am. I don't know what they call you. I know what I get called sometimes. But I know who I am. And I know whose I am. And I know he has a purpose for me. And I believe he has a purpose for you. But it takes conviction. There's going to come a time in your life when somebody asks you to do something you don't want to do, especially if you're in that age group of Daniel and Ezra and Mishael. Somebody's going to be like, hey, just do this. It's not a big deal. Or hey, if you love me, just do this. Or hey, we're just going here for just a little while. It takes conviction sometimes to say, you know what? I got a line. It's okay for me to be friends with you, but I don't have to go there with you. It's okay for me to love you, but I don't have to do that with you. It's okay to have conviction. It's okay to love someone who may not be just like you, someone who's in a culture that maybe is not as Christian friendly as we'd like to be. It's okay to be friends with them, but there comes a place where you say, hey, I can't do that. Whether you like me or not, well, you can call me something else, you can call me cheap, you can call me whatever you want, but I know who I am. Daniel and his boys into it were. But it took conviction. It took patience. It took the right friends. It's okay to have friends of different walks of life, different cultures, different religions, but when you have a close group, net group of people that you confide in, you need someone who's a good Christian friend that has some convictions. And you know what? I'll be honest, it's hard to find. And I'm not saying that to be negative, but I know for me, it's hard to find someone who stands exactly where I do, on what I do. And sometimes I feel like when Laura and I talk, we feel like, are we the only ones? Elisha thought that too, but God showed it different. There's always a remnant. But it's important that of your small, close circle, you need friends that will stand with you, that will hold you up, hold you accountable, and say, hey guys, this is what we need to do. Let's stand firm together. You need the right friends. You need the conviction, you need patience, you need friends, and you need courage. Because it's not easy. It's never easy. Nothing that's worth doing is easy. At least that's what I've found. I could be wrong. It's never easy. It's not easy to even come to church sometimes. But I promise you, I believe that this corporate worship like this is more important now than ever. We've gotten away from it, but it's important. It's necessary. And we need it. So resolve for a new year. Are you resolved? How are you going to handle it? I mean, we could talk about, just like inflation, we could say, well, things are getting so expensive, I don't have to cheat this, I can't do this for God now, or I can't give to this. Well, like I said, it's how you respond to it. It may mean that we, and I say this has always been a joke, maybe you won't be buying the coffee at Starbucks every day, I worked with somebody the other day, I don't want to say too much, but I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I can eat breakfast, lunch, and supper at the hospital. And I don't take it for granted that I work somewhere that has a restaurant, okay? It's not really a restaurant, but you know what I'm saying. They have food there. And I try to put myself on a $5 limit every day. It used to be $2 25 years ago. Now it's $5. Hey, I can still do it. And I work with people that I know spent $80 on one day. I mean, by the time you have it, what do you call that? DoorDash. How do people do that? So here's what I'm saying. We may talk about financially where we're at and inflation, everything's going, But you know what? It is what it is. It's how you respond to it that matters. Spiritually, we look around us, and that's the main thing I want you to focus on right now, this week, today, your life. We look around and say, well, it's just not as easy to do this. It's not as easy to have friends. It's not as easy to spend time with God. But here's the thing. How do you respond to it? You can still do it. 1964, they may have took prayer out of schools, but you can still pray in school. You can pray where you want. And as one person said, as long as there's tests in schools, there'll be prayer in schools. You can do that. Or somebody asking me, back when all the situation came up with marriage rights and marriage laws in the United States, it says, well, do you have to do this? I don't have to do anything. You don't either. It's fine to understand and live in this culture that we're in. To be friends with people that don't believe just like you. But there comes a line where you're going to have to stand by your convictions. And you're going to have to be patient and understand that God, you may not see the fruit from it. There's fruit from this that we're still reaping that Daniel never got to see. But I'm glad he did. Or you have a song of some sort. You just want to have Laura do something. I know, they say, talk about feeding. I remember the farmer, when the guy said, well, my Lord said, if only one cow shows up, the farmer said, I still have to feed them. He said, yeah, but you don't have to give them the whole load. I feel like maybe the wagons were full. I unloaded everything on you this morning, but I think it's important that we understand how this works and how the book of Daniel speaks to us, how he was resolved